The dive was perfect, the reef alive with vibrant life. But then the smaller fish scattered, a warning I didn't understand until it was too late. The shadow moved with precision, silent and deadly. I turned too slowly to see the jaws rushing toward me. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start with today's shark attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. Click the like button, and let's get into the story. The sun was just beginning to rise over Santa Cruz's main beach, its fiery orange glow casting long, golden streaks across the rippling water. The air was cool, crisp, and damp with the lingering chill of night. Emily Carter pulled her paddleboard from the roof of her faded blue Subaru, the soft rustle of her movements the only sound in the pre-dawn quiet. This was her ritual and early morning paddle to center her thoughts before her day teaching yoga. It was her sanctuary, her church, the one time she felt truly at peace. She set the board down on the sand, leaning her paddle against it, and adjusted the leash around her ankle. The sand was cold beneath her bare feet, a reminder of how the ocean seemed to hold onto the night longer than the land. Emily gazed out at the water, its surface smooth and glassy, kissed only by the faintest of breezes. A hint of trepidation whispered in the back of her mind, but she dismissed it. She had paddled here alone many times before, though she knew the waters were shark territory. She preferred not to dwell on the thought. "You're overthinking again," she whispered to herself, shaking her head with a soft laugh. The beach was empty, save for a lone jogger in the distance, their silhouette bobbing steadily against the shoreline. Emily lifted her board, balanced it on her hip, and waded into the shallows. The cold water licked at her calves, a sharp contrast to the warmth of her wetsuit as she climbed onto the board and pushed off into the gentle surf. The world felt suspended as she paddled farther from shore. The rhythm of her strokes was steady, her body swaying slightly with each push. The city behind her faded into a haze of muted colors, swallowed by the vastness of the ocean. She loved this feeling, this sense of detachment from the chaos of life. Out here, it was just her and the sea. She paddled out far enough to lose sight of the sandy bottom. The water deepened into a cold, dark green. She sat back on her board, letting the paddle rest across her knees, and closed her eyes. The ocean rocked her gently, a cradle of liquid serenity. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the salty, mineral-rich air, and exhaled slowly. Time stretched in the stillness. Emily's thoughts drifted like the water beneath her, settling into a calm she rarely found elsewhere. Her eyes remained closed as she tilted her face toward the sky, basking in the sun's first rays. The first ripple came without warning. A faint, almost imperceptible disturbance in the water broke the calm. Emily opened her eyes, her brows knitting in confusion. She glanced around, her paddleboard shifting slightly beneath her. A few yards away, a pod of seals splashed at the surface, their sleek bodies darting in chaotic bursts. She smiled. "Hey guys," she murmured, watching the playful group. She had always found the seals endearing, their antics a charming distraction. But something was different this time. Their movements were erratic, frantic. They weren't playing, they were fleeing. Emily's smile faltered. Her hand instinctively tightened on her paddle as she watched the seals vanish beneath the waves. The water was silent again, too silent. A chill ran through her, though the sun was beginning to warm the day. She squinted at the surface, scanning for any sign of movement. The stillness felt wrong now, as though the ocean were holding its breath. She shook her head, trying to brush off the creeping unease. "Stop being paranoid," she muttered. "It's just the ocean." She dipped her paddle into the water and began to stroke toward shore, her movements slower this time. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been. The quiet seemed heavier now, pressing in around her. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her strokes, the reassuring dip and pull of the paddle cutting through the water. Then came the bump. It was sudden and jarring, a forceful thud from beneath her board that sent her sprawling onto her knees. Emily gasped, gripping the sides of the board to steady herself. Her heart thundered as she looked down at the water, her eyes wide and searching. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The board tilted slightly again, as though something massive was moving beneath it. Panic gripped her chest like a vice. She turned, trying to look in every direction at once, her paddle now clutched in both hands like a weapon. "Stay calm, Emily," she whispered. "Stay calm." The words felt hollow even to her. She knew the statistics, the warnings she had so often ignored. Her silhouette on the board could easily be mistaken for a seal, especially in the dim morning light. She had always dismissed the stories of shark attacks as rare and unlikely, but now, she was acutely aware of the vulnerability of her position. Alone in deep water with no one close enough to help, the next strike came with terrifying force. A massive, shadowy shape surged beneath the board, flipping it almost completely. Emily screamed as she was thrown into the water, the cold shocking her system. She surfaced quickly, sputtering and gasping, clutching at the overturned board. Her mind raced. She kicked her legs instinctively but stopped almost immediately, remembering what she'd read about sharks being attracted to splashing. Her breaths came in short, sharp gasps as she gripped the edge of the board, trying to pull herself back on. And then she saw it. The dorsal fin broke the surface a few feet away, cutting through the water with unrelenting purpose. Her breast caught in her throat. It was enormous, its sleek, gray form moving with terrifying precision. The great white shark circled her, its black eyes glinting just above the surface. "No, no, no," Emily whimpered, tears mixing with the salt water on her face. She clawed at the board, her injured hand slipping on its slick surface. She managed to haul herself halfway up, her body trembling uncontrollably. The shark struck again, this time breaching partially out of the water, its jaws clamping onto the edge of the board. Emily screamed as the force of the attack sent her tumbling back into the ocean. The water churned around her, a frothy mix of bubbles and blood as the shark's teeth tore into the fiberglass. "Help! Somebody, help me!" she screamed, her voice raw with terror. But the beach was too far, and her cries were swallowed by the vastness of the ocean. The shark circled back, its dark form gliding just below the surface. Emily clutched her paddle, raising it above her head like a spear. Her arms shook as she prepared for the next attack. "Get away!" she shouted, her voice breaking. She swung the paddle with all her strength as the shark charged. The blade connected with its snout, the impact reverberating up her arms. The shark veered away momentarily, but it wasn't finished. Emily's chest heaved as she clung to the remnants of her board, her mind consumed with one thought: survive. The water around her was cold and heavy, each passing second dragging her closer to exhaustion. She knew she couldn't last much longer. The great white shark circled again, its movements deliberate, unhurried. It was a predator and she was prey. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she clung to the remnants of her paddleboard, her hands trembling and slick with salt water. The calm serenity of the morning had been shattered, replaced by the violent chaos of survival. The great white shark continued its slow, deliberate circles beneath her, its massive shadow a silent, stalking presence. "Come on, Emily, think," she muttered to herself, her voice a panicked whisper. She clutched her paddle tightly, her only weapon, though she knew it was woefully inadequate against the sheer power of the predators circling her. The cold water bit at her exposed skin, seeping through the tears in her wetsuit where the fiberglass shards of her broken board had ripped through. She dared to glance down, and her heart froze. The shark's outline was clear now, its massive body cutting through the green depths with terrifying precision. The creature was larger than she had imagined, its sleek, muscular form a testament to nature's raw, unyielding design. She knew enough about sharks to understand that this wasn't a random encounter. It had identified her as prey, and every movement she made only reinforced its instincts. "Stay calm. Stay calm," she whispered, her voice trembling as she tried to focus on her breathing. Panic would only make her movements erratic, attracting the shark further. But the primal terror gripping her chest made it nearly impossible. Another bump rocked the board, this time more forceful. Emily screamed, tightening her grip on the paddle as the shark tested its target. The impact sent her sliding halfway off the board, her feet plunging into the icy water. She scrambled back on, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. "Help! Somebody, please!" she cried, her voice cracking as she turned her head toward the shore. It was far too far. There was no one in sight, no lifeguards, no early morning surfers, no joggers. Just the endless expanse of ocean and the looming predator. A massive splash broke the surface as the shark surged forward, its dorsal fins slicing through the water like a blade. Emily's scream echoed across the empty waves as she instinctively swung her paddle, aiming for the creature's head. The paddle struck the shark's snout with a hollow thud. The predator recoiled briefly, but the strike only seemed to anger it. Emily knew the fight wasn't over. The water around her turned into a churning froth as the shark circled tighter, its movements faster, more aggressive. Emily's breath hitched as she watched the fin disappear below the surface. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the broken board, her paddle ready for another desperate swing. A terrifying silence settled around her. The water was eerily still, the only sound her own ragged breathing and the faint lap of waves against the shattered paddleboard. She knew what was coming. The shark was preparing for its next strike. And then it happened. The creature erupted from the water with shocking speed, its massive jaws open wide, rows of serrated teeth glinting in the sunlight. Emily barely had time to scream before the shark clamped down on the edge of the board, shaking it violently. She was thrown into the water, her paddle slipping from her hands as the force of the attack ripped it away. Emily surfaced with a frantic gasp, thrashing as she tried to orient herself. The salt water stung her eyes and throat, but she couldn't stop moving. She glanced toward the board. It was still afloat, but barely, its edge shredded where the shark's teeth had torn through. "Stay calm. Stay calm," she whispered again, her voice cracking as she treaded water. She knew she couldn't rely on the board anymore. It was too damaged to offer any real protection. Her legs burned as she kicked, trying to keep herself afloat while scanning the water for the shark. It wasn't hard to find. The dorsal fin reappeared, slicing through the surface just a few feet away. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she watched it approach, the creature's movements deliberate, predatory. Her mind raced, desperately trying to remember the survival tips she had read once in an article about shark attacks. Don't splash too much. Maintain eye contact. Fight back if necessary. The advice felt useless now, abstract and disconnected from the raw terror of the moment. But she had no choice. It was either fight or die. The shark came closer, its massive body just below the surface, the cold blackness of its eyes locking onto her. Emily forced herself to keep looking, her chest heaving with adrenaline-fueled breaths. "Not today," she muttered, her voice shaking. "You're not taking me today." As the shark closed the distance, Emily reached for the broken remnants of her paddleboard. Her fingers closed around a jagged piece of fiberglass, its edge sharp and splintered. She held it like a dagger, her hands trembling. The shark struck again, this time ramming into her legs with its snout. Emily screamed as the impact sent her spinning through the water. The creature's rough skin scraped against her calf, leaving a searing trail of pain. She swung wildly with the shard of fiberglass, the motion more instinct than strategy. The sharp edge connected with the shark's side, cutting into its gray flesh. A thin trickle of blood clouded the water. The predator thrashed, its tail whipping through the waves as it veered away. Emily used the brief reprieve to swim toward the board, her strokes frantic and uneven. The shark circled again, its movements more erratic now. Emily climbed onto the board, her body shaking violently from cold and exhaustion. She clutched the shard of fiberglass tightly, her knuckles white. "I'm not done yet," she whispered through gritted teeth. The shark charged one final time, its massive body surging through the water like a torpedo. Emily braced herself, raising the shard of fiberglass. As the shark lunged, she plunged the shard down with all her strength, aiming for its snout. The makeshift weapon struck true, piercing the shark's sensitive nose. The creature recoiled violently, thrashing and churning the water into a frothy chaos. Emily held on to the board for dear life, her body trembling with fear and adrenaline. The shark dove beneath the surface, disappearing into the green depths. For a moment there was silence. The water stilled, the only sound Emily's ragged breathing. She scanned the surface, her eyes darting in every direction, waiting for the shark to reappear. But it didn't. The predator was gone, retreating into the deep, its instincts finally sated or perhaps deterred by the unexpected resistance. Emily collapsed onto the board, her body limp with exhaustion. Her chest heaved as she sobbed, the adrenaline finally giving way to the raw emotion of what had just happened. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. She didn't know who she was thanking, the ocean, herself, or some higher power, but the words came unbidden. She wasn't safe yet. The shore was still far, and her injuries were starting to take their toll. But for now she was alive, and that was enough. A distant cry reached Ryan Delaney as he sat straddling his surfboard, scanning the horizon for the next set of waves. It wasn't the usual sound of joy or excitement he sometimes heard on early mornings. It was sharp, raw, filled with terror. He turned his head, his stomach tightening. "Did you hear that?" Ryan asked, his voice urgent. His friend, Jake Morales, was a few yards away on his own board, his hands skimming the surface of the water. "Hear what?" Jake asked, looking up from his idle movements. Ryan listened again, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the open water. Another scream ripped through the quiet morning, faint but unmistakable. "Dare! Someone's in trouble." Ryan's voice rose as he pointed toward the distant figure floundering on the water. The shape was small, barely distinguishable, but the frantic splashes and the shadow of a circling dorsal fin left no doubt in his mind. His heart seized. "Holy shit, that's a shark," Jake muttered, his face pale. He paddled closer to Ryan, instinctively seeking the safety of proximity. "We have to help her." Ryan's hands gripped the edges of his surfboard as he started paddling toward the figure. "Are you insane? That thing's massive." Jake hesitated, his gaze darting between Ryan and the water ahead. "What if it comes after us?" Ryan glanced back, his expression resolute. "We can't just leave her. Look at her, she's not going to make it on her own." He paddled harder, the muscles in his arms burning as adrenaline coursed through his veins. Jake cursed under his breath but followed, his strokes clumsy with fear. "This is a bad idea, man. A really bad idea." As they closed the distance, Ryan could make out more details. The woman clinging to a battered paddleboard, her movements desperate and uneven. Blood streaked the water around her, a crimson plume spreading like ink in the green sea. The shark's dorsal fin was still circling, the predator's path tightening. "Hey, hold on. We're coming," Ryan shouted, his voice strained as he fought the resistance of the water. The woman's head snapped up at the sound of his voice. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic and exhaustion. "Help me, please," she cried, her voice breaking. Ryan's board sliced through the water as he approached. "Just stay on the board. Don't move too much, okay? We'll get you out of here." The shark's dorsal fin dipped below the surface, disappearing into the depths. Ryan's stomach churned. The unpredictability of the predator's movements made the situation even more terrifying. Jake slowed as he neared the scene, his breathing shallow. "Where is it? I don't see it." "Exactly," Ryan muttered grimly. He stopped paddling for a moment, his eyes scanning the water. "Just stay alert." The woman Emily, though Ryan didn't know her name yet, was trembling, as she tried to pull herself higher onto the shattered paddleboard. "Dick, it keeps coming back," she stammered, her voice hoarse. "I hit it, but it's not leaving." Ryan reached her first, maneuvering his board close enough to grab her arm. "We're going to get you to shore, okay? Just hang on to me." I can't," Emily whispered, shaking her head. "It's still here. Look at me," Ryan said firmly, his voice cutting through her panic. She met his gaze, her breathing ragged. "We're not leaving you out here, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Emily nodded weakly, though tears streamed down her face. She reached for his outstretched hand, her grip slippery and weak. "Jake, get over here and help me," Ryan called over his shoulder. Jake hesitated, glancing at the water nervously. I'm coming," Jake muttered, paddling closer. He positioned his board on Emily's other side. "What's the plan? She can't stay on that thing, it's falling apart." "We'll get her onto one of our boards," Ryan said, his tone sharp with urgency. "I'll take her and you watch for the shark. If it comes back, distract it." Jake blinked at him. "Distract it? Was what?" "My charming personality." Ryan shot him a glare. "Just do it." Jake grumbled but nodded, his eyes flickering nervously toward the open water. "Fine, let's make it quick." Emily groaned in pain as Ryan and Jake worked to steady her. Her shoulder and leg were bleeding heavily, the torn fabric of her wetsuit clinging to her wounds. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through her body, but she bit her lip to keep from crying out. "Okay, I've got you," Ryan said as he pulled her onto his board. The added weight made it wobble precariously, but he adjusted quickly, positioning her so she could cling to the edges without slipping off. Emily's voice was barely audible. "It's coming back." Ryan's head snapped up. The shark's dorsal fin was back, cutting through the water with chilling speed. It was heading straight for them. "Jake!" Ryan shouted. "It's coming." Jake swore loudly, his eyes wide. Without thinking, he splashed the water with his hands, yelling as loud as he could. "Over here, you bastard! Come on!" The shark veered slightly, its attention momentarily drawn to Jake's commotion. Ryan didn't waste the opportunity. "We have to move now. Paddle! Jake, paddle!" Jake's strokes were frantic as he propelled himself away from the approaching fin. Ryan followed, his muscles screaming with the effort of carrying both himself and Emily. The shark lunged toward Jake's board, its sleek body breaching the surface for a split second. Jake screamed, lifting his legs onto the board as the predator's jaws snapped. Inches away. "Go, Jake! Don't stop!" Ryan yelled. The shore was still a distant blur, but Ryan focused on each stroke, his determination overriding his exhaustion. Emily clung to the board, her breaths shallow and rapid. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize," Ryan said, his voice firm but kind. "You're going to make it. Just keep holding on." Jake let out another shout as the shark circled back. "It's not giving up, man. What the hell do we do?" "Keep going. We're almost there," Ryan shouted, though his arms felt like lead. The beach was getting closer. He could see the lifeguard stand now, a small but vital beacon of safety. "Help!" Jake screamed toward the shore. "Somebody help us!" Ryan stole a glance over his shoulder. The shark was closing the gap again, its movements faster, more aggressive. He could see its dark eyes, cold and unfeeling, as it locked onto them. Then, a new sound broke through the chaos. A lifeguard's whistle, sharp and piercing. Ryan's heart surged with relief as he saw two lifeguards sprinting into the water, carrying a rescue skiff between them. "Over here!" Ryan yelled, his voice hoarse. The lifeguards paddled toward them with practiced efficiency, their expressions grim as they assessed the situation. One of them, a woman with a calm but commanding presence, shouted, "Get her on the skiff, now!" Ryan and Jake worked together to lift Emily onto the small boat. Her body was limp, her skin pale, but she clung to consciousness as the lifeguards secured her. "Is it still out there?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. The other lifeguard nodded toward the fins still circling nearby. "It's not going anywhere yet. Let's move." Ryan climbed onto the skiff, his body trembling with exhaustion. Jake stayed on his board, paddling alongside them as they made their way to shore. The shark followed for a few more harrowing seconds before finally sinking beneath the waves, disappearing into the depths. As the skiff reached the shallows, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Medics were already waiting, their equipment ready. Emily was lifted from the boat and placed on a stretcher, her eyes fluttering closed as shock set in. Ryan stumbled onto the sand, collapsing onto his knees. Jake dropped his board beside him, shaking his head. "That was insane," he muttered. "We could have died. But we didn't," Ryan said, his voice quiet. He glanced toward Emily as the medics worked to stabilize her. And neither did she. The sound of the ocean was deafening now, its vast expanse both beautiful and terrifying. For Ryan, it would never feel the same again. The rescue skiff hit the shallows hard, sending a spray of cold seawater across the team of lifeguards as they maneuvered it onto the wet sand. The crowd on the beach parted like a living wave, their murmurs blending with the distant crash of the surf. The medics rushed forward, carrying a stretcher and a flurry of supplies. "Stay with me," Ryan said, his voice strained as he crouched beside Emily, who lay motionless on the rescue skiff. Her skin was pallid, her wetsuit torn and soaked with blood. He reached for her hand, his own shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. "Emily, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, and she let out a faint groan. "Ding. It hurts," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know, but you're safe now," Ryan reassured her, though his own heart was racing. His words felt hollow. The image of the shark circling beneath them still haunted him, a primal terror he couldn't shake. "All right, let's move," commanded Tara Rias, the lead lifeguard, her tone clipped and urgent. She jumped off the skiff and turned to the medics. "She's got significant blood loss, lacerations to the left leg and shoulder, likely deep tissue damage. Keep her warm and stabilize her." The medics nodded as they worked swiftly, lifting Emily onto the stretcher. She winced and cried out, her voice sharp and raw. "Karefun, Karefun." Ryan pleaded, stepping back but unable to fully let go. "Sir, we need space," one of the medics said, his tone firm but understanding. "We've got her." Ryan hesitated, then nodded, his hands falling to his sides. He stumbled back, his legs weak, and watched as they began wrapping Emily's wounds with thick gauze. Blood seeped through almost immediately. "Tourniquet her leg," the medic said to his partner. "We need to control this bleeding now." The second medic nodded and worked quickly. Ryan's chest tightened at the sight of the makeshift band. Emily let out another cry, and he clenched his fists, helpless. From the edge of the crowd, Jake approached, his surfboard tucked under one arm. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "Does she?" He started but didn't finish the question. Ryan shook his head, his gaze still locked on Emily. "She's alive, barely." Jake sighed heavily, running a hand through his damp hair. "That shark was massive. I've never seen anything like it." "Me neither," Ryan replied, his voice low. His eyes darted to the horizon, scanning the water instinctively. The ocean looked deceptively calm now, its surface glittering under the morning sun. But he knew better. "I couldn't let her die out there," Ryan added, his voice almost a whisper. "I couldn't just watch." "You did more than most people would," Jake said. "We both did." Ryan shook his head. It wasn't enough. Nearby, Tara approached them, her face set with a mix of exhaustion and determination. "You two did good out there," she said, her voice steady. "But next time, don't put yourselves in that kind of danger. That shark could have turned on you just as easily." Ryan nodded but said nothing. Jake scratched the back of his neck, avoiding Tara's gaze. It's not like we could just sit back and do nothing, he muttered. Tara softened, her eyes flicking toward Emily. I get it. You probably saved her life. But if something happened to you, we'd have more bodies to pull out of the water. Remember that. Jake nodded, looking chastened. Ryan gave a small, tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. A paramedic approached, wiping his hands on his pants. We're airlifting her to the trauma center in San Jose. The injuries are severe, but she's stable enough for transport. Do either of you know her? Ryan hesitated, then shook his head. No, we were out surfing and saw her in trouble. The medic nodded, his expression somber. Well, if you hadn't been there, she wouldn't have made it. You should feel good about that. Ryan nodded absently, his gaze drifting back to the stretcher. Emily's eyes were closed now, her breathing shallow but steady. The medics were wrapping her in a thermal blanket, preparing her for the helicopter that was already on its way. Let us know if you think of anything else, the medic added before walking away. A low murmur rippled through the crowd as the sound of helicopter blades grew louder. The rotor wash kicked up sand, forcing onlookers to shield their faces as the air ambulance descended onto the beach. The medics wasted no time, loading Emily onto the chopper with practiced efficiency. Ryan watched as the helicopter lifted off, his chest heavy. The woman he had pulled from the water was now a tiny, fading figure in the sky. He realized he didn't even know her name. Hey, you all right? Jake asked, clapping a hand on Ryan's shoulder. Ryan nodded slowly. Yeah, I think so. Jake gave him a skeptical look. Dude, you look like you're about to collapse. Ryan forced a weak laugh. Probably just coming down from the adrenaline. Jake hesitated, then said, we should get checked out too. You've got scratches all over you, and I don't think you even noticed. Ryan glanced down at his arms, where faint red marks trailed across his skin. He hadn't felt them in the chaos. It's nothing, he said. I'll clean up when I get home. Jake sighed but didn't argue. The two of them stood in silence, staring out at the ocean. The waves rolled in, unbroken, as if the morning's events had never happened. But for Ryan, the water would never feel the same. What do you think happened to the shark? Jake asked after a long pause. Ryan didn't answer right away. He thought of the dark, cold eyes of the predator, the sheer force of its body as it tore through the water. It's still out there, he said finally. Probably moved on, looking for something else. Jake shuddered. Man, I don't know if I can get back in the water after that. Ryan glanced at him. You will. We both will. But maybe not tomorrow. Or next week, Jake muttered, though there was a faint smile on his face. Tara approached them again, her expression softer now. I know you guys need time to process what just happened, but if you want to talk to someone, the lifeguard station has resources for this kind of thing. Don't hesitate to use them. Thanks, Ryan said, though he doubted talking would help. The memory of Emily's screams and the sight of the shark's dorsal fin cutting through the water would stay with him for a long time. As the sun climbed higher, the crowd began to disperse, the drama of the rescue giving way to the mundane rhythms of the day. Ryan and Jake stayed for a while longer, neither ready to leave. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. I'm glad we were there. Me too, Jake said after a moment. But I hope I never have to see anything like that again. Ryan nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Let's hope none of us do. The bright fluorescent lights of the emergency room stung Emily's half-closed eyes as she was wheeled through the automatic doors on a gurney. The sharp, sterile smell of disinfectant filled the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood that clung to her skin and wetsuit. Voices buzzed around her, distant and muffled, like they were coming from underwater. The pain in her shoulder and leg throbbed with every bump of the gurney's wheels, and her vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. She's lost a significant amount of blood, one of the paramedics said, his voice clipped and steady. Lacerations to the left leg and shoulder, possible arterial damage in the leg. She's stable for now, But we need to act fast. Emily tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The cold mask of oxygen strapped to her face made her feel trapped, her breaths shallow and rapid. She heard someone say her name, her full name, and it startled her. Emily Carter, 24 years old. The paramedic continued. No known allergies according to her ID. Shark attack victim, Santa Cruz. Time of injury approximately 40 minutes ago. The gurney came to a stop under a bank of harsh lights, and Emily felt hands pulling at her wetsuit. A nurse leaned over her, her face kind but focused. Emily, can you hear me? Emily blinked, her lips trembling as she tried to form words. Why, yeah, she managed, her voice faint. You're in the ER, Emily. We're going to take care of you, the nurse said, her tone calm but firm. Can you tell me where it hurts the most? My leg, Emily whispered, and my shoulder. It feels like it's on fire. The nurse nodded. We're going to give you something for the pain, okay? Just hang in there. As they worked on her, Emily caught fragments of conversation around her. BP's dropping 90/60. Prep for a blood transfusion. X-ray and ultrasound on standby. Let's confirm the extent of the damage. Emily flinched as scissors snipped through her wetsuit, peeling it away from her torn skin. She turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of her leg. The sight made her stomach churn. Deep gashes, jagged and raw, carved into her flesh. Blood stained her skin and pulled on the gurney beneath her. Oh my God, she gasped, her voice trembling. Emily, don't look, a voice said firmly. It was a doctor now, his face serious but reassuring. He placed a hand on her uninjured arm. We've got this. You're going to be okay. Focus on me. All right? Emily forced her gaze upward, trying to ignore the chaos around her. I thought I was going to die, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You didn't, the doctor said, his voice steady. You're here now, and we're going to make sure you stay with us. But we need you to keep fighting. Okay? She nodded weakly, though her body felt like it was sinking into the gurney. The adrenaline that had kept her going in the water was gone, replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. Get a morphine drip started, the doctor ordered. She needs to be prepped for surgery immediately. Meanwhile, Ryan and Jake sat in the hospital waiting room, their wetsuits still damp and streaked with sand. Ryan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. His foot tapped anxiously against the linoleum floor. Jake sat beside him, leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed, his face pale. This is taking forever, Ryan muttered, glancing toward the double doors of the trauma wing. It hasn't been that long, Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. They're probably doing everything they can. Ryan let out a frustrated sigh. What if it's not enough? You saw her out there. She was barely holding on. Jake rubbed the back of his neck, his jaw tight. She made it this far. That's gotta count for something, right? Ryan didn't answer. His mind kept replaying the attack, the shark's dorsal fin slicing through the water. Emily's screams, the blood in the waves. He couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness, the knowledge that if they had been just a few minutes later, she wouldn't have survived. A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Ryan Delaney? Jake Morales. They both stood quickly, their movements stiff and nervous. Dance us, Ryan said. The nurse gave them a small, reassuring smile. She's in surgery now. The doctors are optimistic, but it's a complicated case. She's lost a lot of blood, and there's significant damage to her leg. They're working to repair the torn muscles and ligaments. It'll be a long road to recovery, but she's strong. Ryan exhaled a shaky breath, relief flooding through him. She's going to make it? The nurse nodded. We believe so. She's lucky you two were there to help. Jake let out a soft, nervous laugh. Lucky? I don't know if lucky is the right word. Luck comes in different forms, the nurse said gently. Sometimes, it's about the right people being in the right place at the right time. Ryan's gaze drifted toward the doors. "Can we see her?" "Not yet," the nurse replied. "She'll be in surgery for a while and then she'll need to recover. But I'll let the staff know you're here." "Thanks," Ryan said, though the waiting felt like its own form of torture. Back in the operating room, Emily drifted in and out of consciousness as the surgeons worked. Her mind wandered, images of the shark flashing in her mind's eye. She could feel its cold, unrelenting presence, the weight of its jaws around her leg, the terrifying strength that had dragged her under. Her breaths quickened, and a monitor beeped faster in response. "She's panicking," the nurse said. "Give her another dose of sedation," the anesthesiologist said calmly. "She needs to stay stable." As the medication took hold, Emily's body relaxed, but the memories didn't fade entirely. The fear lingered, etched into her very being. Hours later, Ryan and Jake were still in the waiting room when the surgeon finally appeared. His scrubs were stained, his face tired but calm. "She's out of surgery," he said, addressing both of them. "The damage to her leg was severe, but we were able to repair the majority of it. She'll need extensive physical therapy, and there may be some long-term limitations, but we're optimistic about her recovery." "And her shoulder?" Ryan asked, his voice tense. "Deep lacerations, but no critical structures were compromised. She's stable now, but she's going to need time to heal both physically and emotionally." "Can we see her?" Jake asked. The surgeon nodded. "She's being moved to the ICU for observation. She'll likely be groggy from the anesthesia, but you can see her briefly." When Ryan and Jake entered the room, Emily was barely awake. Her face was pale, her eyes half closed, but she turned her head slightly as they approached. "Henning," Ryan said softly, standing beside her bed. "How are you feeling?" Emily's lips twitched in the faintest of smiles. "Like, I got hit by a bus." Jake chuckled nervously. "Well, technically it was a shark." Her smile faded, and her eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was going to die." Ryan placed a hand on the railing of her bed, his voice steady but emotional. "But you didn't. They're here. You fought like hell out there." Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you for not leaving me." Ryan shook his head, his throat tight. "We couldn't have left you. You're safe now, Emily." As she drifted back into a restless sleep, Ryan and Jake exchanged a look, the weight of the day's events settling heavily between them. For now, she was alive, and that was enough. The sterile hospital waiting room felt as though it existed in another world compared to the chaos of the ocean that morning. Ryan sat slumped in one of the hard plastic chairs, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Jake paced nearby, his footsteps echoing on the tile floor. The rhythmic squeak of his damp sandals was the only sound, apart from the occasional murmur of hospital staff passing through the corridor. "How long do you think she'll be in there?" Jake asked, breaking the silence for the 100th time. Ryan shrugged, not lifting his gaze from the floor. "As long as it takes. She just got out of surgery, she's not going anywhere soon." Jake stopped pacing and leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "I still can't believe that happened. I mean, we surf there all the time. I've never even understood an sur shark before. And then today." His voice trailed off, his face pale as he replayed the events in his head. Ryan finally looked up, his expression hard. "It's their water, not ours. It was bound to happen to someone eventually." Jake nodded silently, unsure how to respond. The truth in Ryan's words only deepened the lingering sense of unease. The door to the waiting room opened, and Tara Reyes, the lifeguard who had helped coordinate Emily's rescue, walked in. She carried a clipboard under her arm and a serious expression on her face. Behind her, a uniformed officer from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, CDFW, followed, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Ryan? Jake?" Tara's voice was calm but firm, cutting through the tense atmosphere. Ryan stood, his back stiff. "That's us." The officer extended a hand. "Officer Mark Callahan, CDFW." I'm here to gather information about the incident this morning. We'll also need to file an official report with the local authorities and our department." "Sure," Ryan said, shaking his hand. Jake followed suit, though his grip was hesitant. Tara gestured for them to sit. "Let's go over everything. The more details we have, the better we can understand what happened and issue warnings if necessary." Ryan and Jake sat down, and Tara took the chair opposite them, setting her clipboard on the small coffee table. Callahan remained standing, slipping open a notebook. "Let's start from the beginning," Tara said. "Walk us through what you saw and did, step by step." Ryan took a deep breath, running a hand through his damp hair. "We were out at Main Beach, like we always are. It was early, maybe 6:30. The waves were small, nothing crazy. We were just waiting for a decent set when I heard someone yelling." "Yelling?" Callahan prompted, his pen poised. Ryan nodded. "Yeah, it wasn't loud at first, just panicked. I looked toward the sound and saw her Emily clinging to her paddleboard. At first, I thought maybe she'd fallen and was struggling to get back on. But then I saw the dorsal fin." Jake chimed in, his voice shaky. "That's when we knew it was a shark. And it wasn't just swimming around, it was circling her." Callahan frowned. "Did you recognize the species at that point?" Ryan hesitated, then shook his head. "Not at first, no. But when it came closer, we saw how big it was. It had to be a great white." "That's consistent with recent sightings," Callahan said, making a note. "We've had reports of juveniles in the area this time of year. But the behavior you're describing, circling, striking multiple times, sounds like an adult." Ryan swallowed hard. "It wasn't just circling. It hit her board, flipped it over. She went into the water. That's when we started paddling toward her." "Wait," Tara interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "You didn't hesitate at all? You just went in?" Ryan shrugged. "What else were we supposed to do? Sit there and watch her die?" Jake nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, we couldn't just leave her." Tara exhaled slowly, her expression softening. "That was brave. Risky, but brave." "What happened when you reached her?" Callahan asked. Ryan's jaw tightened as he remembered. She was clinging to what was left of her board, bleeding. Her leg and shoulder were torn up pretty bad. The shark was still there, circling. I could see it beneath the surface. Jake shuddered. "It wasn't just swimming either, it felt like it was waiting, like it was watching us." "Predatory behavior," Callahan murmured, jotting down more notes. Ryan nodded. "We got her onto my board, but it wasn't stable with all three of us." Jake tried to distract the shark by splashing and yelling, but it didn't leave. It lunged at his board. Callahan looked up sharply. "It attacked you?" Jake grimaced. "Yeah, it missed, thank God. Took a bite out of the edge of my board instead." Tara's eyes widened. "You didn't mention that earlier." Jake shrugged weakly. "I was kind of busy trying not to die." Ryan continued. "Eventually, the lifeguards showed up with the skiff. That's when the shark finally backed off. It followed us for a little while, but it didn't strike again." Callahan leaned back against the wall, his notebook resting against his side. "You're lucky to be alive, all of you. Great whites don't usually persist in attacks unless they're committed to a mistaken prey." "Yeah, we know we're lucky," Ryan said, his tone sharp. "But Emily, she wasn't so lucky." Tara reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "She's alive because of you too. Don't forget that." Ryan nodded, though the weight of the morning hadn't lifted. "What happens now?" Callahan stepped forward. "First, we'll file an official record of the attack. The beach will likely remain closed for at least 72 hours while we monitor the area. We'll also increase patrols and deploy drones to watch for shark activity." Jake leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "And the shark?" Callahan frowned. "The shark's just doing what sharks do. It mistook her for prey, most likely a seal. We don't hunt or cull them unless there's an ongoing, immediate threat to human life." Ryan nodded, though he felt no satisfaction. "So he just swims away?" That's it. That's nature, Callahan said evenly. This wasn't a rogue or man-eater. It was a predator following its instincts. The best thing we can do is educate people about the risks and keep them informed. Ryan exhaled slowly. He couldn't argue with the logic, but the thought of the shark, massive and indifferent, still patrolling the waters where they surfed, made his stomach turn. Is there anything else you need from us? Ryan asked. Callahan closed his notebook. No, you've given us everything we need. Thank you for your cooperation. If we need more information, we'll contact you. Tara stood, offering a small smile. You guys should go home, get some rest. You've been through a lot. Ryan and Jake nodded, though neither moved right away. After a moment, Jake stood and picked up his board, glancing at Ryan. You coming? Ryan hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the ICU wing where Emily was being monitored. I'll catch up. I just need a minute. Jake frowned but didn't argue. All right, don't stay too long. You need to sleep. Ryan nodded absently as Jake left, then turned to Tara. Do you think she's going to be okay? Tara's expression softened. Physically, probably with time and therapy, but something like this, it sticks with you. For all of you. Ryan's chest tightened. Yeah, I don't think I'll ever forget it. Tara placed a hand on his arm. That's not a bad thing, Ryan. Fear keeps us careful, and you've already shown you're brave enough to push through it when it matters. He didn't respond. The weight of her words settling over him like a blanket. With a final nod, he turned and walked toward the ICU, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The steady beeping of machines was the first sound Emily became fully aware of as she stirred awake. Her body felt heavy, her mind clouded, and every muscle ached as though she'd run a marathon. When her eyes fluttered open, she was greeted by the muted white walls of a hospital room, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. For a moment, she struggled to remember how she'd gotten there, and then it hit her. The ocean, the shark, the terror. She gasped sharply, her body tensing as the memory surged back in vivid detail, the dorsal fins slicing through the water, the pressure of the shark's teeth, the salt water mixing with her blood. Her breathing quickened, and her heart monitor began to beep faster. A nurse appeared almost immediately, her calm presence a stark contrast to Emily's panic. Peng Heng, it's okay, the nurse said gently, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. You're safe now. You're in the hospital. Emily's wide eyes darted around the room. The shark, she whispered hoarsely, her throat dry and raw. It's gone. The nurse interrupted, her tone soothing. You're safe, Emily. You made it. Emily's body trembled as she tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through her left leg and shoulder, forcing her back down with a pained cry. She looked down to see her leg heavily bandaged, her shoulder immobilized in a sling. The pain is normal, the nurse said, adjusting the four attached to Emily's arm. We've got you on a morphine drip, but I can get the doctor to adjust it if it's not enough. Emily shook her head weakly, tears streaming down her face. I thought I was going to die. The nurse's eyes softened. I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been. But you're here now. You survived. That's what matters. Emily closed her eyes, trying to slow her breathing, but the memories refused to fade. The cold black eyes of the shark, the weight of its jaws, the overwhelming helplessness, it all felt too real, too recent. A knock at the door broke through her spiraling thoughts. The nurse turned and nodded. Come in. The door opened, and Ryan stepped inside, looking hesitant. His hair was still damp from a shower, and he wore a clean t-shirt and jeans, though his face bore the lines of exhaustion. Hey, he said softly, stopping just inside the room. I didn't want to bother you, but I wanted to check in. Emily blinked at him, trying to place the face. Then it clicked. You're the one who saved me. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. Not just me. Jake helped too, and the lifeguards. But you were there. Emily interrupted, her voice trembling. You came for me. Ryan stepped closer, pulling up a chair beside her bed. Of course I did. Anyone would have. No, they wouldn't, Emily said firmly, her gaze locking onto his. Most people wouldn't go near a shark, let alone try to fight one off. You risked your life. Ryan looked down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I saw you out there and I thought, if I don't go, she's not coming back. I wasn't going to let that happen. Emily's lips quivered as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. You saved my life. Ryan reached out hesitantly, placing a hand on the edge of her bed. You're the one who kept fighting, Emily. You didn't give up even when most people would have. That's what saved you. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the morning's events hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Ryan cleared his throat. The doctor said you're going to be okay, but it's going to take some time. Your leg, it's pretty bad. Emily nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward her bandaged limb. It felt like it was crushing me, she said quietly. The pressure, I thought it was going to pull me under. Ryan's jaw tightened. I saw it. That shark was relentless. I don't know how you held on. I don't either, Emily admitted. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. It's all a blur now. I remember thinking I didn't want to die. Not like that. Ryan gave her a small, reassuring smile. You didn't. You're here. Over the next few days, Emily's hospital room became a hub of activity. Doctors, nurses, and physical therapists rotated in and out, each with updates or instructions for her recovery. The bandages on her leg were changed daily, revealing the deep, jagged wounds left by the shark's teeth. The sight made her stomach churn every time. Ryan visited regularly, sometimes with Jake, other times alone. He brought updates from the beach. The shark had not been seen again, but the waters remained closed as a precaution. He also brought small comforts: a bouquet of wildflowers from a roadside stand, a book he thought she might like, even a playlist of calming music for when the nightmares got too intense. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the blinds of her room, Emily finally asked the question that had been weighing on her. Why do you keep coming back? Ryan looked up from the chair where he'd been scrolling through his phone. What do you mean? Emily shifted uncomfortably, wincing as her shoulder protested. You don't have to do this. Visiting me, checking in. I'm a stranger. You didn't know me anything out there, and you definitely don't know me anything now. Ryan set his phone down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. You're not a stranger, Emily. Not anymore. After what happened out there, I don't know. I just feel like I need to make sure you're okay. Emily studied him, her eyes searching his face. It wasn't your fault, you know, the attack. You didn't cause it. I know, Ryan said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He looked away, his jaw tightening. But I was there. I saw how close it was. Keep thinking, what if we hadn't gotten to you in time? What if we'd been too late? You weren't, Emily said firmly. You were there when it mattered. That's all that counts. Ryan nodded slowly, but the guilt in his eyes lingered. I guess I don't want you to feel like you're alone in this. Emily smiled faintly, her heart swelling with gratitude. I don't. Not anymore. Later that evening, a nurse came in with a small stack of papers. Emily, we have the official report from the attack, she said. The local authorities and the Department of Fish and Wildlife wanted you to have a copy. Emily took the papers with trembling hands, scanning the text. The report detailed the events of the attack, from the initial sighting of the shark to her rescue and arrival at the hospital. It included quotes from Ryan and Jake, as well as the lifeguards who had assisted. There was even a note about the behavior of the shark, describing it as consistent with a mistaken prey identification. They think it thought I was a seal, Emily said aloud, her voice bitter. Because of the paddleboard. That's common, Ryan said, glancing at the report over her shoulder. You weren't the first, and you won't be the last. But that doesn't make it any less horrible. Emily nodded, her throat tightening as she read the final lines of the report. Underscore victim sustained severe injuries but survived due to timely intervention by local surfers and emergency responders. Underscore. She set the papers aside, her hands trembling. It's all so clinical. Like I was just another statistic. You're not, Ryan said firmly. To me, to Jake, to everyone who helped, you're not a statistic. You're a survivor. Emily looked at him, her eyes shining with tears. I don't feel like a survivor. You will, Ryan said softly. One day at a time. The days blurred into weeks as Emily began her slow, grueling journey of recovery. The physical pain, though excruciating, was easier to confront than the psychological scars. Her leg, the most severely injured part of her body, was wrapped tightly in bandages and supported by a brace. Her shoulder, immobilized in a sling, was healing, but the limited mobility frustrated her. Still, none of it compared to the fear that gripped her every time she closed her eyes and saw the shark's dark, unfeeling eyes. Her hospital room had become her world, a small, sterile sanctuary where nurses, doctors, and physical therapists rotated in and out. Ryan visited regularly, his presence a consistent reminder that she wasn't alone, even though she often felt like she was. One rainy afternoon, Emily sat propped up in her hospital bed, staring at the window. The drops on the glass blurred the view of the parking lot below. She fiddled with the edge of her blanket, her mind racing. A knock at the door broke her trance. Ryan stepped inside, holding a brown paper bag and a tentative smile. I come bearing gifts, he said, setting the bag on the small table beside her bed. Emily raised an eyebrow, though her lips twitched in the faintest of smiles. If it's another playlist or book, I might cry. Ryan left. No, it's better than that. I figured you've had enough hospital food. So, he pulled out a container of Thai curry and a pair of plastic forks. I brought the good stuff. Emily's eyes widened. You're my hero. I don't think I can eat another bowl of flavorless soup. Well, dig in, Ryan said, handing her a fork. She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the container. Ryan noticed and sat down in the chair beside her bed. Take your time, he said gently. Emily nodded, though the tremor in her hands frustrated her. I hate this, she muttered. Hate what? Ryan asked, leaning forward. Feeling weak, she admitted. Everything feels harder now. Eating, moving, sleeping, even thinking. Ryan's expression softened. You're not weak, Emily. You survived something most people can't even imagine. Your body's healing, it takes time. Emily stared down at the curry, her appetite fading. I don't feel like myself anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in the water. I can feel it, the teeth, the pressure, the cold. It doesn't go away. Ryan leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. That makes sense. You went through something traumatic. It's not going to just disappear overnight. She looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears. What if it never goes away? Ryan hesitated, then said, It might not, but it'll get easier. I know that probably sounds impossible right now, but trust me, it will. Emily sniffled, wiping her eyes with the edge of her blanket. How can you be so sure? Ryan offered a small smile. Because you're stronger than you think. The next day, Emily's physical therapist, Tina, arrived for her first session. Hannah was in her mid-30s, with a no-nonsense attitude and a kind smile. She rolled a portable walker into the room and set it beside Emily's bed. All right, Emily, Hannah said, clapping her hands. Today, we're going to see how that leg of yours is holding up. Think you're ready to take a few steps? Emily's stomach churned at the thought. I don't know if I can. Hannah crouched down beside her, her tone firm but encouraging. I won't lie to you, it's going to hurt, and it's going to be hard, but you can do it. One step at a time. Okay? Emily glanced at Ryan, who had taken his usual seat in the corner of the room. He gave her a nod of encouragement. You've got this. Taking a deep breath, Emily swung her legs over the edge of the bed. The sharp pain in her injured leg made her wince, but she bit her lip and pushed through it. Hannah positioned the walker in front of her and held her arm for support. "Nice and slow," Hannah said. "You're in control." Emily gripped the walker tightly, her palms sweating. She placed her good foot on the floor, then tentatively put weight on her injured leg. Pain shot through her, sharp and searing, but she didn't collapse. "That's it," Hannah said. "Now the other foot." Emily gritted her teeth and moved forward, her steps awkward and shaky. Each movement felt like a monumental effort, but after a few steps, she made it to the door of her room. "You're doing great," Brian said, standing up to cheer her on. "Seriously, Emily, that's amazing." Emily managed a weak smile, though tears blurred her vision. "It doesn't feel amazing. It feels like hell." "That's because it is," Hannah said matter-of-factly. "But hell doesn't last forever. You're proving that right now." As the weeks passed, Emily's physical therapy sessions grew more intense. Each step forward, literal and figurative, felt like a battle. Her leg ached constantly, and her shoulder throbbed with even the slightest movement. The pain made her irritable, and she pushed through it, driven by a determination she didn't fully understand. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Ryan found her sitting by the hospital window, her eyes distant. "Tay," he said softly, sitting beside her. "Rough day." Emily nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like I'm moving so slowly, like I'll never be normal again." Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're not moving slowly. You're healing." "That's not the same thing." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "It feels the same." Ryan was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, I've been surfing my whole life. It's the one place where I feel totally at peace. But after what happened with you, I haven't been back in the water." Emily turned to him, surprised. "Why not?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess I'm scared, not just of the shark, but of what it all means. The ocean isn't as safe as I thought it was. And maybe I'm not as strong as I thought I was." Emily studied him, her expression softening. "But you still came out there for me. You were strong when it mattered." Ryan met her gaze, his eyes serious. "So were you." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared experience hanging between them. Finally, Emily said, "Do you think you'll ever surf again?" Ryan smiled faintly. "Yeah, but not yet. What about you? Do you think you will ever paddleboard again?" Emily's stomach twisted at the thought. "I don't know. Just thinking about it makes me want to crawl under a blanket and hide." Ryan nodded. "That's fair. But if you ever decide to try again, I'll be there. I promise." Emily looked at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you." One night, as Emily lay in her hospital bed, she pulled out a small notebook Ryan had given her. It was blank, save for the note he'd written on the first page. "Write it down. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you're thinking, get it out." She stared at the blank page for a long time before picking up a pen. Slowly, she began to write, "I'm afraid. Every day, I feel like the ocean is still out there, waiting to swallow me whole. But I'm also grateful. Grateful to be alive. Grateful for the people who saved me. Grateful for the chance to keep fighting. I don't know who I am anymore, but maybe that's okay. Maybe I'm still figuring it out." She closed the notebook, her hand trembling. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small glimmer of hope. She wasn't okay yet, but she would be, one step at a time. It was a cool, crisp morning when Emily made the decision to go back to the beach. After months of recovery, both physical and emotional, she felt ready. The physical therapist had been working with her for weeks to regain strength in her leg. Her shoulder was nearly healed, and though she still woke up with flashes of terror from the shark attack, something inside her told her she needed to face the ocean again. The fear still lingered, sitting heavy in her chest every time she thought about it. But if she didn't do this now, would she ever? The memories of the attack, the shark's cold, unfeeling eyes, the pressure of its jaws around her leg. The sense of helplessness would haunt her forever. But if she let the fear control her, the ocean would win. And Emily wasn't going to let that happen. She stared out the window of her small apartment, watching the waves crash against the shore in the distance. The sun had barely risen, the sky a wash of pink and orange. It was a quiet morning, the calm before the day's chaos began. In the distance, she could see a handful of surfers catching waves, their figures outlined against the horizon. A soft breeze blew in through the window, the salty scent of the ocean filling the room. It was peaceful, too peaceful. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but there was a strange pull, a longing she hadn't realized was there until now. She had to try. She had to prove something to herself. Emily had spent hours the day before preparing herself mentally. She'd gone over every possible scenario in her head. The panic, the fight, the helplessness, the terror. She'd gone over the steps to calm herself down. Slow, deep breaths, focus on the horizon, keeping her movements deliberate and controlled. She had packed a small bag with a fresh wetsuit, sunscreen, her board, and a towel. The essentials. She'd also called Ryan the night before, telling him of her plan, though she'd left out just how terrified she was. "Are you sure you're ready?" Ryan had asked, his voice thick with concern. Emily had hesitated, her grip tightening on the phone. "I don't know, but I have to try, Ryan. I can't keep running away from it. You don't have to do this alone. You know that, right?" "I know," she'd said, smiling softly into the phone. I need to do this on my own first." Ryan had stayed quiet for a moment, as if weighing his words. "All right, but if you need me, I'll be there. You just call and I'll come. I'll be okay," she'd assured him, though even she wasn't entirely sure. As she walked down the familiar path to the beach the next morning, the air felt sharp, the sand cold under her feet. Her heart raced in her chest, a strange mixture of excitement and dread. The beach was almost empty, save for a few early morning joggers and a lone surfer who was already out in the water, riding the gentle waves. Emily took a deep breath and stood still for a moment, letting the sound of the ocean wash over her. The waves, which had once been a source of comfort and calm, now seemed distant, indifferent. She hadn't been in the water since the attack, and the thought of it made her stomach tighten. But she had to face it. She reached the spot where her board was resting against the sand and knelt down to unzip her bag. The wetsuit felt foreign in her hands, its thick material reminding her of the last time she'd worn it before everything had changed. Her leg, though mostly healed, still ached when she moved it too quickly, but she forced herself to slip into the suit, pulling it over her body with shaky hands. Once dressed, she grabbed her board, the weight of it comforting in her hands, though it also reminded her of the fear she had felt in the days after the attack. The board was the thing that had failed her, the thing she had clung to for survival. It had once been a symbol of peace, of calm. Now it felt like a reminder of the nightmarish encounter. She walked toward the water, every step feeling heavier than the last. The sea stretched out before her, its surface calm and inviting. The horizon was clear, the waves gentle but persistent. It was beautiful, and it terrified her. She set her board in the shallow water, standing beside it for a moment, her hands trembling. She glanced around, hoping no one would notice her hesitation. The early morning quiet had a way of making everything feel personal, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting for her to make her move. Finally, she pushed the board into the water and waded in. Her foot sank into the wet sand with each step, the cold water creeping higher until it reached her knees. She felt a rush of anxiety, her chest tightening as she remembered the last time she'd been submerged in these waters. The fight, the struggle, the fear, the shark. Get on the board. Get on the board and paddle. She repeated the mantra in her head, forcing herself to focus. Slowly, she bent down and straddled her board, pushing it further into the water with one hand. Her fingers gripped the edge as she lay down, adjusting her body to find the familiar balance. For a moment, nothing happened. She was just there floating on the water, feeling the rise and fall of the waves beneath her. The world seemed to hold its breath. The distant sounds of seagulls and the soft crashing of the waves filled her ears. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythm of the ocean calm her nerves, just for a moment. But then it came, the memory, the wave of panic, the sudden, overwhelming rush of fear, the feeling of being watched, of something large beneath her, circling, waiting. Her heart began to race again, her breath shallow. It's just water, she told herself, just the ocean. Is not the shark. Is not happening again. But her body refused to listen. Her muscles tensed, her legs shaking as she fought to stay on the board. The calm, reassuring sounds of the ocean felt distant now, as though she were underwater again, with the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. A wave broke gently beside her, and Emily nearly lost her balance, her heart leaping into her throat. She gasped for breath, fighting the rising panic, but the fear was like a weight on her chest, keeping her tethered to the past. "You're okay. You're okay," she whispered to herself. Though the words felt foreign in her mouth, she forced herself to lay down again, adjusting her body, trying to focus on the water beneath her. The waves were smaller today, but she had to paddle to keep from drifting too far out. Tentatively, she began to stroke with the paddle, each movement feeling heavier than the last. She was aware of every sound, every shift in the water, every splash. Her breath came faster, her pulse quickening, and then she saw it, the dorsal fin. It was just a shadow at first, cutting through the water in the distance. Her heart skipped, her breath catching in her throat. She froze, eyes wide, heart hammering in her chest. It wasn't real, couldn't be real. She had to focus, but the fin was still there, growing closer, a sharp, unmistakable shape cutting through the waves. Her mind raced as panic took hold, her pulse thundering in her ears. "Calm down," she muttered to herself, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not the same. It's not the same. Just breathe." She was paralyzed, her body refusing to move. The shark was out there, somewhere, and all she could do was watch, helpless. The cold sweat on her palms made it difficult to grip the paddle, and her mind screamed at her to swim to shore, to get out of the water, to escape. "Focus," she told herself, her voice trembling. "You're not in the same place. You're not the same person." The fin dipped beneath the surface, disappearing from sight. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she waited, her body trembling. She kept her eyes trained on the spot where it had been, her breath shallow. It didn't return. For a long moment, she lay there, frozen, her body still trembling. Then, slowly, cautiously, she began to paddle again. The ocean felt different now, empty, quiet. But in that silence, there was something else. A small sense of peace, a delicate acknowledgement that she had faced her fear and survived. She paddled slowly, each stroke more deliberate, more controlled than the last. The tension in her body slowly began to ease, though her heart was still racing. The waves carried her toward the shore, and she could feel herself drifting closer to safety. When her feet finally touched the sand, she stopped. She let the board rest on the water, the gentle waves washing over her ankles as she took a deep, steadying breath. She had made it. She wasn't sure how long she stayed there, just standing in the water, the board beside her. The memories of the attack still lurked in the back of her mind, but they didn't have the same power over her anymore. The ocean had been the thing that had nearly taken her life, but it was also the thing that had given it back. It was part of her, part of who she was, and though she couldn't ever forget what happened, she didn't need to let it define her. Emily took one last deep breath, turning her face toward the rising sun. The waves still crashed, relentless and ever-present, but for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel so terrifying. They felt like home. She was ready. The ocean felt different now. Emily could still hear its rhythmic pulse, the sound of waves crashing against the shore, but it was quieter, more distant. It wasn't the familiar lullaby of the sea she had once loved. It was colder, darker. And now that she had faced it, it had a weight she couldn't shake. She stood at the edge of the beach, staring out at the horizon, her eyes scanning the deep blue water. It was a beautiful morning, the sun rising slowly behind the mountains and casting a soft golden hue over the coast. She could hear the distant hum of a few early morning surfers paddling out, their boards cutting through the water with effortless grace. But for Emily, it felt like the calm before the storm. It had been months since the attack. She had made significant progress physically. Her leg, though still marked with scars, had healed enough to allow her to walk with only a slight limp. Her shoulder was nearly fully functional again, though it would never be the same. But the emotional scars were harder to heal. They were the ones no one could see, the ones that clung to her like the salt water on her skin. She took a deep breath, the salty air filling her lungs, and stepped forward. It was the same path she had taken countless times before, back when the ocean had been a place of joy and serenity. Now, it felt like an old friend who had turned into something else entirely. The water was a reminder of the shark, of the terror that had consumed her that day, and of the fear that still lurked inside her, waiting for the next wave of panic to hit. Ryan had been there for her every step of the way. He was the one who had pulled her from the water, the one who had stayed by her side through the endless doctor's appointments, the physical therapy, and the sleepless nights. He had been her constant, the one person who understood what she was going through, even when she couldn't explain it herself. And yet, Emily hadn't seen him in days. She had asked him to give her space. She needed to face the ocean alone, to prove something to herself. But now, standing here at the edge of the water, she wasn't sure what she had to prove. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face it again, to go back into the depths where the fear had first taken root. "Are you going in?" A voice called from behind her, breaking her thoughts. Emily turned, startled. It was Jake, his surfboard tucked under one arm, his face a mix of concern and curiosity. He had been a constant presence in her life since the attack, though his visits had become less frequent. He had his own demons to fight. He still hadn't gone back in the water himself, too shaken by what he had witnessed that day. But now, seeing her here on the beach, it seemed like the perfect moment to check in. "I don't know," Emily replied honestly, shrugging. "I was just thinking about it. I'm not sure if I'm ready." Jake stepped forward, his expression softening. "You don't have to do it today. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for." "I know," Emily said quietly, her voice barely audible. "But I don't want to be afraid anymore. I don't want the fear to control me." Jake nodded, his eyes understanding. "I get it, but fear is a funny thing. It's not something you can just push aside. It doesn't go away that easily." Emily turned back toward the water, her gaze distant. "I know, but I've been running from it for months. I can't keep doing that." There was silence for a moment as Jake watched her, the weight of her words hanging in the air. He could see how hard this was for her, how deep the battle inside her ran. She had fought her way back from the brink, physically and mentally. But this was something else entirely. "I can't go back out there yet," Jake said, breaking the silence. "I'm not ready." Emily glanced at him, her heart heavy. "I don't expect you to be," she said quietly. "This is my fight, not yours." Jake smiled softly, his eyes sincere. "I'm still here for you, though. You don't have to fight it alone." Emily's throat tightened. "I know, but I need to do this on my own." She stood there for a long moment, staring out at the water, the waves coming and going like they always had, relentless and unyielding. The sound of the surf was oddly comforting, a constant reminder that life moved on, no matter what. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind ruffle her hair, the cool air against her skin a sharp contrast to the heat building in her chest. "You can do this. You've already survived. You're stronger than you think." Finally, she turned toward Jake, who was watching her quietly, his face full of concern. "I'm going in," she said, her voice steady. Jake didn't protest. though his eyes were full of worry. "Just be careful. You don't have to push yourself too hard." Emily nodded, offering him a small smile before walking toward the water. She could feel the sand beneath her feet, soft and cool, the tide pulling at her ankles as she waded deeper. The first step was always the hardest, the unknown feeling like an enormous weight bearing down on her. The water reached her knees, then her waist, the cold shock making her breath catch in her throat. She hesitated, looking out at the horizon, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, without thinking, she took the plunge. She grabbed her board, positioning herself to lie flat, and paddled out, slow and steady. The waves were small today, but they were there, pushing her forward with gentle insistence. Each stroke of the paddle was a fight against the fear. Each wave that came closer was a reminder of what had happened, of what could happen again. The first few minutes were the hardest. Every shift in the water, every ripple beneath her board, sent her mind racing. She could almost feel the shark circling, its dark form lurking beneath the surface, its cold, unblinking eyes watching her. But this time she kept her focus. She wasn't going to let the fear take control. She couldn't. She refused to let it win. As she paddled farther from shore, the ocean around her seemed to calm. The waves slowed, the water smoother. She breathed deeply, her chest rising and falling with each steady inhale. For the first time since the attack, she felt a flicker of peace. "You're doing it," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible against the sound of the waves. "You're actually doing it." A part of her still wanted to turn back, to head straight for the shore where it felt safe, where the fear wouldn't be so overwhelming. But she didn't. She stayed on course, paddling farther. She wasn't going to let the ocean dictate her life. She wasn't going to let it hold her captive anymore. After a few more minutes, Emily stopped paddling and sat up on her board, her legs hanging over the sides. The water was still, the sun rising higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over everything. It was peaceful, quiet, and though the fear still lingered, it wasn't as suffocating as it had been before. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the dorsal fin breaking the surface, the shark coming back for another strike. But there was nothing, only the gentle rhythm of the waves, the sound of the ocean. For the first time in months, Emily felt truly alone, not in a bad way, but in the way you might feel when you've overcome something, when you faced down your fears and survived. She stayed there, sitting on her board, breathing in the air, listening to the ocean. She didn't know how long she sat there. Time seemed to stretch and bend in the quiet of the morning, but she was at peace. Eventually, she paddled back toward the shore, each stroke feeling easier than the last. Her body was tired, sore in places she hadn't realized could hurt, but it felt good. She had faced the ocean, she had survived it, and she was going to be okay. When she reached the shore, Jake was waiting for her, his surfboard propped up on the sand. He was watching her with wide eyes, his face full of disbelief. Emily climbed off her board, her legs shaking with exhaustion, but there was a smile on her face. "I did it," she said, her voice a little breathless but filled with quiet triumph. Jake blinked, then grinned, his face lighting up. "You actually did it." Emily nodded, still smiling. "I'm not saying I'm ready to dive back in just yet, but I think I can handle the ocean again." Jake stepped forward, offering her a hand. "I'm proud of you, Emily." She took his hand and pulled herself up, her legs wobbling. "Thanks for being here, for everything." Jake laughed softly. "You didn't need me to do it, but I'm glad I was here anyway." Emily looked out at the ocean, the vast expanse of waters stretching out before her. The waves were still, the horizon unbroken. She didn't feel afraid anymore. The ocean, with all its power and mystery, was just part of the world she lived in, and it didn't have to control her. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the peace she had once known, the easy, carefree serenity of the sea, but it was a new kind of peace, one that came with acceptance, with survival. One that came with the understanding that the ocean, like everything in life, could be both beautiful and terrifying, and she could live with that, because after everything she had learned to survive, and that was enough.